Okay, hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Institute for Northern Studies 2022 seminar series. On what is a very dark day for Europe, it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and new faces in the crowd tonight, and you're very much welcome. For those that don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I am a lecturer at the Institute for Northern Studies, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now, before introducing our speaker tonight, I've got a couple of very boring, but I promise very quick technical points that I'll speedily run through. The first is just to say that tonight this session is being recorded, and just to make everyone aware of that. And if anyone wants to submit a question at any point tonight during the presentation, I would ask that you submit it via the chat function as opposed to the Q&A function, if possible. Just when you're addressing your question, if you put it in as a question to all panelists, it just means that it'll come up to everyone and we can read them out in the discussion part of the presentation. And I think that's everything I need to say, so we can pass the boring bit out of the way. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who's a returning son to Orkney. It's Professor Peter Marshall. Now, most of you will know that Peter is very much a leading authority on the Reformation in Britain and of early modern cultural and religious belief more generally. He has written on a vast range of topics, and his works cover a huge breadth of scholarship, but he's perhaps best known for his work on the English Reformation, including his book Heretics and Believers, a history of the English Reformation. More recently, Professor Marshall has been returning to his roots in some ways and looking at the early modern church in Orkney, and that's going to be the topic of his paper tonight. So with no further waffle from myself, I'd like to introduce Professor Marshall, and you can take it away.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew, and thanks everybody for coming. Part of me would rather be in Kirkwall, I must admit, but this is definitely the next best thing. So I suppose we go straight to the slightly drum roll moment as to whether or not I can share my screen successfully. Looking relatively good so far. And I'm now, I think, ready to go.
There we go. Excellent.
Yep, just back to the beginning there. So I want to start this paper tonight with a sad little story from the early summer of 1628. Margaret Linney, a young Servian woman from the parish of Evie in the northwest of the Orkney mainland, appeared in front of the presbytery meeting in St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. She was suspected of murdering her newborn baby. At first, the girl denied ever being pregnant, but under questioning, she changed her story and admitted she had ein bairn. The infant was lost because ein, like a man, came out of the sea and took away the child. This explanation failed to satisfy the ministers of the presbytery, who referred the case to the magistrate. In January 1629, the young mother was tried in the sheriff court in Kirkwall, where she confessed to the crime of infanticide. She was sentenced to be taken by the hangman to the mouth of the Oise, the sheltered harbourage of Kirkwall, known today as the PDC, and there put to death by drowning. For early modern historians, it's an incident of a familiar kind, though with a distinctive Northern Isles twist, a case of mutual miscomprehension between mentalities and cultures we usually call, with the appropriate caveats, popular and elite. The accused, in a state of distress and desperation, invoked ancient Orcadian folkloric beliefs about interaction with amphibious magical creatures. Such spirits, known variously as finfolk and selkies, could take human shape and form emotional and sexual relationships with regular people. Like their land-bound fairy cousins, selkies might take human children away with them into their own realm. A motif found in the Orcadian ballad, The Great Selkie o Sulskerry, written down in the 19th century and later recorded by, among others, Joan Byers, John Denver, and Sarah Jane Gibbon. The ministers of the Orkney Presbytery, however, would not have recognised the term folklore. The case was one of gross sinfulness, compounded by ignorance and superstition. Nothing like a man emerged out of the sea, and even if it had, it could only have been a demonic spirit or a delusion of Satan. My aim today is to survey and evaluate attitudes among parish ministers in Orkney to the prevalence and persistence of unorthodox and magical beliefs within their congregations, and also to assess what those congregations may have thought of the powers and potential of their ministers. I range across the broad sweep of the early modern period, from the later 16th century to the beginning of the 19th. Orkney, I want to suggest, represents a particularly interesting study in the confrontation and occasional accommodation of lay and clerical views about access to supernatural power. I hope there are illuminating parallels as well as contrasts with what was happening elsewhere, but I'm hesitant to present this as a case study, a methodology which assumes the priority and greater significance of macro processes observed at the micro level. Orkney was and is its own place, and it presented its own kind of challenges to the post-Reformation pastoral ministry. Orkney had a contemporary as well as modern reputation for remoteness and peripherality. So despite what was sometimes suspected in Edinburgh, it was scarcely ungoverned in ecclesiastical matters. An Orkney presbytery was in operation from the late 1580s, providing a focus for sociability as well as policy making for usually about 18 ministers from various island and mainland parishes. Periods of episcopal governance saw fairly rigorous oversight. Orkney's post-Reformation bishops, James Law and George Graham before the Civil Wars, Andrew Honeyman and Murdoch Mackenzie afterwards, were conscientious and often resident. Looking across the period as a whole, perhaps the most striking characteristic of ministers in Orkney parishes was that they had come to them from elsewhere. By my calculations, of 204 ministers serving in Orkney between 1560 and 1800, only 38, or 18.6%, are likely to have been born in the county. The percentage was significantly lower in the 17th century and a bit higher in the 18th, though largely as a result of sons following fathers into the clerical profession. Virtually all extended commentary on the social and religious condition of early modern Orkney was written by clergymen and therefore by outsiders. The earliest instance is a 16th century Descriptio Insularum Orcadiarum. The oldest surviving manuscript gives the date as 1529 and the author's name in abbreviated form as Joe Ben. But the date is certainly wrong, as the text references events from later in the century. One plausible theory is that an early copyist made a slip of the pen, writing 1529 for what should have been 1592. James Irvine has put forward a persuasive identification of Joe Ben with the minister John Boner, who served for a time in North Ronaldsay. The Descriptio is a fascinating ethnographic document, which describes a number of traditions of varying degrees of credibility relating to the different islands. Through the text, however, runs an undercurrent of hostility to beliefs and practices regarded as ungodly or superstitious. Here you may discern their fictitious and fantastical traditions, Joe Ben writes with respect to Einhallow, the small holy island in the narrow but treacherous tidal sound between the Orkney mainland and Rousey. It was an old belief here that if corn was cut after sunset, blood would drip from the stalks. North Ronaldsay people were said to be quite ignorant of the divine word, while those of Shappensea worship the fairy and other evil things. Inhabitants of Stronsey also believe firmly in the spirits of the countryside, the fairy, and they say that folk who die suddenly spend their lives thereafter with them, Joe Ben adding, although I do not believe it. Stronsey is the one location in Orkney Joe Ben mentions staying. There he became acquainted with a farmer's wife who was troubled at night by a sexually rapacious spirit. Ben understood it was one of a class of sea spirits called trowies, who often targeted local women. He supplies a remarkable description. It is clad in seaweed. In its whole body, it is like a foal with curly hair. It has a member like that of a horse and large testicles. The account has affinities with later Orcadian folk tales of a terrifying sea creature, hybrid of man, horse, and fish, known as the Nukkalavi. Joben helped the woman secure relief by urging her to pray, give alms, and fast. These were the biblically attested methods of Protestant exorcism, acceptable where the holy water and Latin prayers of the papists were not. It is, however, the only example I've found of clerical involvement in an exorcism. Though a belief in illness caused by spirit possession seems to have been common, a clutch of mid-17th century cases involve attempts to diagnose whether someone's sickness was caused by a sea spirit, a hill spirit, or a kirk spirit. So it was not ministers who were turned to for this service. One further entry from the Descriptio merits a mention. It concerns the Broch of Dearness, a rocky promontory at the far eastern end of the Orkney mainland. This was a site of early settlement and also of a medieval chapel, which Ben, slipping from Latin into Scots, tells us is called the Bairns of Broch. He reported how people of all ages from different islands gathered to scramble with difficulty up the slope to the chapel. And there they'd walk 2 or 3 times around it, making incantations and throwing stones and water behind their backs. Here, he concluded, they do not worship God purely. Pilgrimages to sites of pre-Reformation sanctity, particularly old chapels, were a disciplinary problem for the clergy in various parts of Scotland. Orkney possessed a remarkable number of them. Around 150 medieval chapels have been identified, at least 10 in South Ronaldsay alone. The practices reported at the Broch of Dearness illustrate the futility, when it comes to the belief system of early modern Orcadians, of trying to draw clear lines between magic and religion. Almost certainly, supplicants at the Dearness Chapel were seeking relief from bodily infirmities. Stones and water, often in combination, appear regularly in rituals of magical healing described in 17th century Orkney witchcraft trials. Their usage exemplifies magical rules of touch, transmission, and sympathetic action. Through proximity or contact with the body of the sufferer, ailments transferred into the inanimate substances, which were then discarded. So there was always the risk that the disease might pass into the body of another human or animal, whether through carelessness or malice. Another practice at the Broch of Dearness, circumambulation of the chapel, also appears in witchcraft trials. There are at least 5 cases dating between 1616 and 1660, where people accused of witchcraft either went themselves or directed others to go to various chapels and walk round them as part of a procedure of healing. This apparent conflation of popish religion and popular magic was perhaps just what the clergy expected to find. The Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563 opened with reference to heavy and abominable superstition used by divers of the lieges of this realm. The Act, as Julian Goodare has persuasively argued, was likely drafted by a zealous minister, quite possibly John Knox himself, and it aimed at ruthlessly stamping out popular superstitions associated with unreformed Catholic culture. It made no direct mention of the devil, and in fact intended to criminalize charmers and healers, purveyors of magical services in demand in local communities. With quite extraordinary ferocity, the Act stipulated that their clients should also face the death penalty. That seems never to have happened, and Goodare suggests that throughout Scotland, the legislation was applied by the courts in a way different from that intended by its author. Charmers, whom both parishioners and ministers saw as distinct from malevolent witches, might periodically be disciplined by sessions and presbyteries, but they didn't face the capital penalties of criminal law. My impression is that this does hold true for Orkney, but not entirely so. Of the known Orkney witchcraft cases, there are 39, for which trial records permit detailed inspection of the accusations. In an extraordinary total of at least 30 of these, the charges include not only cursing, but healing. Ditties note without any apparent sense of incongruity that so-and-so had become completely healthy again by your witchcraft and devilry. In other words, the distinction between charmers and witches was a permeable one. The power to harm and the power to heal were vested in the same individual. Charmers were not automatically thought of as witches, but there was always potential for them to be suspected of supernatural malevolence if cures went awry or otherwise inexplicable misfortune descended. Such suspicions only turned into prosecutions if they were taken seriously by a range of judicial bodies, kirk sessions, synods or presbyteries, and the sheriff court in Kirkwall. The latter, uniquely in Scotland, was permitted to prosecute witches on its own authority, rather than having to apply to the Privy Council for constitution of special commissions of justiciary. Judicial autonomy doesn't seem to have led in Orkney to the kind of unrestrained witch hunting found in some other peripheral European jurisdictions free of centralised control. But Orkney's witch trials in the early and mid-17th century were severe enough for a community of its size. And they pose in a particularly acute way a question often asked about the European witch trials in general: how far they emerged from a gulf of cultural understanding between educated clerics and illiterate rural parishioners. There's an additional element in the Orkney case, and to start exploring it, we can turn once more to Joe Ben's The Scripture. In that text, Orcadians are always they, never us. Perhaps the most intriguing part of the entire document is a throwaway line on how they use their own way of speaking, as when we say, "Good day, good man," they say, "Goan da, bunde," etc. Now that etc. might be the most frustrating abbreviation in the history of modern linguistics. It abruptly terminates one of only a tiny handful of recorded fragments of speech in a lost native language of the British Isles, the Norn tongue, once dominant in Orkney and Shetland, a variant of Old Norse analogous to Icelandic and Faroese. Bounde, like Bune in modern Norwegian, is a farmer, but also equates to countryman or resident and can be translated well enough as fellow. There is, I suspect, an echo of this ancient salutation in the cheerful greeting still ubiquitous in modern Orkney and to be found, I think, nowhere else in Britain: "Quit like the day by." So far as we know, none of the ministers appointed to Orkney parishes after the Reformation could speak or comprehend Norn, and they must sometimes have misunderstood what they were hearing. Joe Ben's name for the chapel on the Broch of Dearness, the Bairns of Broch, was surely a malapropic rendering, his or someone else's, of a straightforward Norn description: Bairnhus, prayer house or chapel. Perhaps the clergy's lack of linguistic facility didn't matter much. Scholars are agreed that the Norn language in Orkney had long been in retreat. There is, for example, no written document from the islands in Norse after 1425. The pre-Reformation church was itself a powerful vector of Scottish and mainland influence. During the long episcopate of Thomas Tulloch, 1418 to 61, Scots replaced Norn as the language of administrative and legal documents, and subsequent bishops of Orkney, all, with the exception of one stray German, Scots, placed kinsmen and chaplains in church offices. Nonetheless, historians of Orkney may have exaggerated the extent to which the kirk was entirely Scoticized prior to the Reformation, placing too much trust in an unsubstantiated claim of the early 20th century Norwegian historian Anton Willem Brugge that we can say with fair certainty that not only was there not a single Norse ecclesiastic in the diocese after 1450, but not even a native of the Orkneys or Shetlands. Charter evidence, in fact, produces a smattering of late medieval chaplains with distinctively island surnames like Flett and Magnusson. When Bishop Robert Reid reformed the constitution of St Magnus Cathedral in 1544, he included provisions for the provost, archdeacon, and subdean to preach several times a year in vulgari, the common tongue. Now, probably Scots, the prevailing language in Kirkwall, was meant here, but we can't be entirely sure. The provost at the time, Malcolm Halcrow, a dominant force in the diocese during the frequent absences of Bishop Reed, very likely spoke the Norn language. He came from a family of wealthy Udal farmers long established in South Ronaldsay and claiming implausible descent from a 12th century king of Norway. Through his patterns of acquisitive landholding and his extensive brood of illegitimate children, Halcrow was indigenized in a way his Protestant successors would struggle to be. One of them, Edward Richardson, was indeed slandered in a South Ronaldsay alehouse in 1661 by a woman who called him and his wife ferryloopers, the disparaging term for incomers still, I'm afraid to say, sometimes used in Orkney. Norn's decline was inexorable, but it was remarkably sluggish. At the start of the 18th century, it was reported of the mainland parish of Harry that there are a few yet living who can speak no other thing. Deponents in a legal case of 1757 claimed not only that Norn was spoken widely in their youth, but that they had overheard conversations in the language within the last couple of years. Norn certainly died out over the course of the 18th century, but the travel writer and Church of Ireland Bishop Richard Pocock may have been slightly premature when, after visiting Orkney in 1760, he was able to report, "There is now no Norn or Norwegian spoken, but all English, with the Norwegian accent." The peculiarity of the accent was commented on a dozen years later by George Lowe, a clerical tutor and talented naturalist from Forfarshire, about to take up a posting as Minister of Bursey and Harry, the heartland of Norn speech in Orkney. "People," he wrote in 1773, "now altogether speak English, but they struggled with the sounds th and que, and pronounced words like queen, question, thing, three as queen, question, ting, tree. According to their old Norn dialect, this corruption of their English is observable at first hearing them talk to any stranger." Just when the tipping point came for Norn, and how, within a bilingual society, one language displaces or absorbs another, are matters about which specialists have long been in dispute. What's clear, however, is that through the later 16th century and all of the 17th, linguistic pluralism was part of the cultural landscape in Orkney, across which the largely immigrant clergy had to navigate. In 1605, the Edinburgh jurist Sir Thomas Craig claimed, with some exaggeration, that though in the previous century nothing but Norse had been spoken in Orkney and Shetland, the ministers of God's word now use English in church and are well enough understood. But that well enough begs a few questions. As Craig's comment implies, the Reformation itself accelerated the triumph of Scots English. In a survey written in the 1640s, Walter Stewart, minister of South Ronaldsay, conceded that the Old Gothic or Norwegian language was still used in some of the islands and was most vigorous in the mainland parishes of Orford and Harry. But alongside it flourished the vernacular of the Scots, of whom a large number dwell among them, especially holding office in the church and state. Revealingly, the highest praise Stewart could summon for native Orcadians was that they either express or try to express the humanity and civility which they have taken from Scots who live among them. It was perhaps a sense of a cultural battle already being won that differentiates Orkney from other parts of the larger Atlantic archipelago where Protestant Reformation took place in a bilingual context. Ireland, Wales, the Scottish Highlands, the Channel Islands, Cornwall, the Isle of Man. With the exception of Cornwall, where the timescale of the decline of Cornish seems broadly to mirror that of Orkney Norn, there was everywhere some recognition on the part of church authorities that translations of Bibles and liturgical texts and provision of preachers competent in the local tongue were necessary or desirable tools of evangelization and conversion. Even in Cornwall, Alex Walsham has recently argued, some Protestant use of the Cornish language, orally and in manuscript, helped the circulation of Reformation ideas. There's a marked contrast between Orkney and parts of the Western Isles, where, as Jane Dawson showed in a magisterial essay, Protestant ministers worked with the grain of Gaelic culture and language to embed Calvinism. Over time, the waning Norn language became to some clergymen an object of antiquarian curiosity. The only known text in Orkney Norn is a version of the Lord's Prayer, collected by James Wallace, minister of St Magnus, sometime before his death in 1688, and printed in the posthumous 1700 edition of his description of Orkney. It was included in the polyglot collection Oratio Dominica, published in London the same year, containing versions of the Lord's Prayer in over 100 languages and exotically labelling the Norn one as Orcadica. It is possible, therefore, that through much of the 17th century, some Orkney people still remembered and may even have been using an ancient vernacular form of prayer at a time when the Bible and all official services were in English. The likelihood that this favor I ricimere was an oral deposit rather than a scholarly reconstruction is perhaps strengthened by the fact it lacks the doxology, for thine is the kingdom, etc., which is used devotionally by Protestants, but not by Catholics. Were these words mumbled by pilgrims to the Ben Hus at the Broch of Demise as they scattered their stones and water? Well, we'll never know. Still, the possibility must be taken seriously, I think, that far into the 17th century and even thereafter, the bilingualism of many Orcadians also generated a kind of cultural bilingualism, or perhaps we might say a cultural amphibiousness, creating spaces for emotion and imagination where the minister and kirk could not go. It's impossible here to resist reciting an undated tradition recorded by the 19th century Orkney antiquarian Walter Trail Denison. It concerned a laird of North Scale in Trail Denison's native Sandy, who on his deathbed sent for the minister of the parish and asked him to pray over him. When the clergyman started, the laird cried out, awa, we a sly Scotch tongue, I want you to pray in the Danska tongue. It shall never be seen that ony ane prayed over me in the Ferryloopers Java. The poor minister confessed he could not pray other than in his own language. It's a poor tale, said the laird. But a college-bred man can pray in the Danska tongue. Doesn't it take that anything but a Danska prayer would open the gates of paradise for me? Well, maybe some such incident did take place, though this seems likely to be a fanciful or at least embroidered account. But there are some more reliable indications that while English was the unchallenged public language of early modern Orkney, Norn could function as a subaltern private one. An Aberdeen apothecary recording his impressions in 1670 thought there were now only 3 or 4 parishes where the people still spoke rude Danish, chiefly when they are at their own houses. Wallace made the revealing comment in 1684 that some of the common people among themselves speak Norse or the old Gothish language. There's a hint of conscious exclusivity in the records of a court case from 1703. It involved some men from Rendell in the West Mainland accused of assembling riotously to prevent a troop of soldiers impounding horses for non-payment of cess. Various witnesses, all East Mainlanders, testified to seeing the armed men in and around the smithy, but they could not report what they had said, as they spoke among themselves upon Norn, which this deponent understands not. Ironically, to speak upon a language, på engelsk, på norsk, was itself a characteristically Scandinavian syntax. One of the classic anthropological distinctions between religion and magic is that the former has a public character while the latter is quintessentially private. It's hard to be certain about this, as the surviving court records are all in Scots English, but it's likely that charmers and healers in Orkney conducted some of their clandestine business in the old tongue. There are a few scattered hints of Norn inflecting an alternative world of custom and belief. Annie Taylor, a suspected witch plying her trade across the North Isles and tried in St Magnus Cathedral in 1624, had a Norn nickname, Runa Roa, or Red Runa. In Stronsey, there was and is a strong folk memory of an early 17th century witch called Scota Bess, who summoned up mists to lure ships onto the rocks. It's possible that Scota is a version of Skoda, an obscure Norse term for a sea fog. A more securely documented witch is Jonnet Rendell, alias Jonnet Rigga, tried and executed in 1629. Rigga was the name of a now vanished small farm on the coast of the parish of Rendell, which may have been Jonnet's place of birth. But it seems unlikely to be coincidental that in Norn, Rigga could also be a scornful term of address for a woman. The Faroese philologist Jakob Jakobsen, author of the first modern scholarly study of Orkney and Shetland Norn, pronounced confidently in 1911 that Norn was the language that witches used in Shetland and Orkney in their spells and incantations. I'm not sure we can be certain this was routinely the case, but it's not intrinsically implausible. Jakobsen gave the example of a charm from Westry designed to cure headaches. The rinje i the tangvangos i the caput, a wonderfully promiscuous mix of English, Norn, and Latin. Tangvango is from the Old Norse tunvangi, the temples, and rinje derives from thina, a pain or stabbing. Writing in the 1920s, the Orcadian linguist Hugh Marwick remembered an old rousy man telling him of a witch on the island who summoned up a storm by her vigorous churning of milk. When it spilled out from the mouth of the cairn, she declared with grim satisfaction, "Taragot, that's done." This Old Norse phrase, "hat ryot," may well have been employed in incantations through the preceding centuries. One fragment survives from the trial record itself. In 1633, the Sandy witch, Marian Rickett, confessed that as part of a ritual of healing, she took a bucket of water and owned it in bit. In the record of the trial, the clerk of the court immediately added a gloss on the phrase, which, to expone it into right language, is as meekle as she did blow her breath therein. Norn was never, in the post-Reformation landscape of Orkney, right language. Its slow cultural retreat may have served to invest words and phrases with an eerily familiar yet unsettling character, rendering them uncanny in the Freudian sense of the term. Norny, according to Marwick, had by the 18th century come to mean curious, angular, old-fashioned. To invoke another Freudian term, Norn had also acquired an association with the taboo. In the Northern Isles, a remarkable number of specialist terms associated with fishing in the sea derived from Norn. 19th and early 20th century folklorists often observed how Orkney fishermen habitually used Norn substitutes for taboo words and phrases. It was considered particularly unlucky while at sea to make any reference to the kirk, which instead was called the bonhouse. Orkney's unique political, linguistic, and cultural inheritance didn't generate very much in the way of overt resistance to the implementation of Reformation, but it did represent a considerable practical challenge for the Protestant ministry. It's of course a well-established idea that early modern witchcraft trials arose from a mighty and murderous misunderstanding, the convergence of popular belief in nature spirits and harmful interpersonal magic, and elite theological notions involving the demonic pact. Historians of Scottish witchcraft in particular have discussed how women's narratives about interaction with fairies were refracted through the trial process to become unwitting confessions of contact with the devil. In fact, other than in formulaic references to him as the source of the witch's power, the devil doesn't appear particularly often in Orkney witchcraft cases, and fairies too show up rather less frequently than one might expect. But the trials nonetheless illuminate the cultural gulf between graduate ministers and illiterate parishioners. One indicative case is that of Elspeth Riach, tried before the Kirkwall Sheriff Court in 1616. Riach was a piper's daughter from Caithness with a complicated personal story. She came to Orkney in or around 1614 and was in a relationship with one of the supporters of Robert Stewart, bastard son of Patrick Stewart, deposed Earl of Orkney. Robert raised an unsuccessful rebellion on behalf of his imprisoned father in that year. A spate of witchcraft trials in Kirkwall in 1616 is probably related to a desire on the part of the loyalist Bishop James Law to demonstrate divine approval for the restoration of royal authority. Elspeth's powers as healer and fortune teller were gifted to her by Ein Fairyman she first met in Lochaber. The ferryman, whom Elspeth also described as the ghost of a deceased kinsman, seemingly followed her to Orkney and warned her to leave the islands and go to her own country, because this country was priest-gone. This, he explained to her, meant there was o'er many ministers in it. That would have come as news to members of the Orkney Presbytery, who always considered themselves chronically understaffed. But it must reflect a recognition on the part of women like Elspeth Rhea that the clergy disliked their activities, and also perhaps an awareness it was easier for ministers to police such matters in Orkney's compact island parishes than in the diffuse, thinly populated ones of the Highlands. Rhea's trial was a road crash of rival cosmologies. In her imagined world, there was room for fairies and spirits of the dead, for visions and magical prophecies, and she seemed willing enough to talk about them. But for the clerics drafting the ditty, there was only God and the devil, whilk she calls the fairyman. Jonet Rendell's trial adds a still more distinctively Orcadian twist to the theme. Jonet sealed her own fate by confessing to various acts of magical harm in revenge for perceived slights. But she ascribed all her powers of healing and of harming to a mysterious being she called Wallyman. He taught her these occult secrets after she first encountered him 20 years earlier in the Rendell Hills, clad in white clothes, with a white head and a grey beard. Jonet admitted praying to Wallyman, who punished people on her behalf. In the prosecutors' minds, there was, of course, no doubt this was the devil, whom you called Wallyman. The proceedings against Jonet Rendell, like those of Elspeth Rhea, were printed in a 1903 compilation of county folklore, and so have become well known to students of the witch trials. Wallyman was drafted into service for Margaret Murray's notorious thesis about the survival of organised pre-Christian religion in early modern Europe. A number of other scholars, more judiciously, cite him as an example of a fairy familiar or spirit guide. What has not previously been realised is that Wallyman may well have been a real person. It was the alias of an itinerant charmer called Oliver Leask, convicted as a warlock by the Sheriff Court in 1616. He was judged to be out of his wits, and so was sentenced to be whipped and expelled from Orkney. Leask's modus operandi was almost identical to Rendell's, a combination of offering cures and demanding alms with magical menaces. Leask and Rendell plied their trade in exactly the same part of the West Mainland. Indeed, one individual is named in the trials as a client of them both. Leask's sudden disappearance from Orkney after 1616 might help explain why, in the succeeding decade, he came to assume in Jonet's mind a more than merely human status. As to the name itself, there seems likely to be a connection with the Old Norse vulva, meaning a seer or prophetess. It's not entirely clear whether Wallyman was an epithet Leask chose for himself or one given to him, for either way it identified him as a figure of magical power and authority. The term klokkerman, from the Old Norse klukka, meaning clever or wise, does not, to my knowledge, appear in the 17th century Orkney records. But charmers and medicine men operating under that label were said in the 19th century to have been once numerous enough in the Northern Isles. 31 Orkney witchcraft accusations, more than a third of the known total, can be assigned to just 2 years, 1643 to 4. This was indeed a witch hunt, a time when ministers sought information about suspects in their parishes and forwarded it to the sheriff depute, who in turn consulted them about the framing of charges. Orkney witches at this time begin appearing in batches. 4 from North Ronsley alone in June 1643, a likely sign they were naming each other rather than being identified through individual accusations. The spurt of local godliness happened at a dramatic moment on the national stage, the signing of a solemn league and covenant by which the Scots agreed to help English parliamentarians bring about reformed religious uniformity in the two realms. A significant Orcadian prelude was the spectacular fall in 1638 of Bishop George Graham. Walter Stewart helped draw up a list of charges, which he carried to the General Assembly in Glasgow, and which led to Graham's abject renunciation of all episcopal power and jurisdiction, with the whole corruptions thereof. One of the accusations made against Graham by the Orkney ministers was that he did many times, charmers and such like being brought before him in the presbytery, extenuate their faults so far as he could, saying that all their practices were but trifles, and that he could do as much himself. Witch hunting had its own logics. 1643-4 was a time of higher than average, but not exceptional activity through the rest of Scotland. Nationally, the largest spikes in known accusations, so-called witchcraft panics, came in 1629-30, 1649-50, and 1661-2. all periods when, with the partial exception of 1629, very few trials took place in Kirkwall. The Orkney suite may nonetheless have responded to outside stimulus. In the early 1640s, the General Assembly showed renewed concern with witchcraft, passing acts in 1640 and 1642 when it was associated with notorious vices which abound in the land, especially in the northern parts. Both of these edicts linked witchcraft to charming, and the association was stronger still in a third ordinance of August 1643. Because charming is a sort and degree of witchcraft, and too ordinary in the land, it would be enjoined to all ministers to take particular notice of them, to search them out, and such as consult with them. In Orkney, the permeable line between charmers and witches probably helped a ministerial crackdown on the former turn into a roundup of the latter. One casualty of the purge appears in an order of the Orkney Presbytery from April 1644. The elf belt, to be destroyed, in respect it hath been a monument of superstition, and the silver of it being melted, payment to be given out of the box unto the owner for the same. Nothing more is known about this intriguing item, but an elf belt must have been a protective device, perhaps to guard the wearer against the possibility of being shot by the troughs. It thus belonged to the same genus as the troughs glove that the suspected witch Catherine Craigie was accused of laying on the neck of a woman in Rousey in 1640. Yet the fact that the elf belt was inlaid with silver makes it unlikely to have been the artifact of a poor charmer, and its owner was a person of sufficient note to be compensated rather than prosecuted. That's the image there, very speculatively, is just a late medieval belt with silver inlay, which might show the sort of thing that we're talking about here. If language and ethnicity were elements in the Orkney witchcraft trials, there's little doubt that what we can anachronistically call class was also in play. Henry Smith, Minister of Shappensey, was convinced the death of his mother-in-law was the result of some hard words uttered to her by a woman called Margery Papley. Margery Papley, however, was no itinerant charmer. She was a member of one of Orkney's oldest and most illustrious families, and prior to her widowhood, wife to two prosperous Kirkwall burgesses. Her eldest son, by the first of those marriages, the merchant James Bakey, was perhaps the wealthiest man in the county, possessor of a landed estate in Tankernas and of a recently acquired grand townhouse in Kirkwall, which anyone who's been to Kirkwall will, of course, recognise. Over the course of 1642 to 5, the fate of Margery Papley divided respectable Orcadian society down the middle. Bakey, assisted by a network of well-connected kinsfolk and with support from the St Magnus Kirk Session and a couple of allies in the ranks of the ministry, used every legal and procedural expedient he could think of to stymie the investigation. There was most likely a factional political dimension to the case. The ministers supporting Bakey, Patrick Waterston of Rousey and James Morrison of Evie and Rendell, were ideologically committed to the cause of the Covenant. In 1650, when the Marquess of Montrose landed in Orkney prior to his ill-fated invasion of Scotland, they refused to sign an oath of loyalty to him, drawn up and subscribed by ministers who'd earlier supported Smith. In the course of the inquiries, another suspected witch confessed she'd seen Margery copulating with Satan in a field outside Kirkwall, and also named as witches two of Margery's sisters, her daughter Elspeth and Ursula Foulsey, wife of a former sheriff depute and daughter of the first Protestant minister of the cathedral. These were not friendless old women, but prosperous wives and mothers in Kirkwall's urban elite. No formal charges were ever brought against Margery Papley or members of her family. There would be a few trials of witches in Orkney after this, but 1644 was a high watermark and perhaps a kind of watershed. To most Orcadians, accusations based on naming of names by other witches and with explicitly demonological elements were less plausible than ones rooted in the experience of neighbourhood malice. And when chain reaction witch hunts began to single out wealthy and important people, the authorities understandably started to get cold feet. In the second half of the 17th century, references to witchcraft continue to appear in the records of Orkney's presbytery and kirk sessions, but increasingly it was accusers who found themselves subject to disciplinary action for defamation. Folk beliefs were gradually decoupling from the preoccupations of the ministers. Fairies and trowels remained part of the islanders' mental world, but they no longer automatically evoked associations with the devil. When, in 1668, an author man claimed that Barbara Hutchison consorted with the fairies and had borne them 4 children, the priority for the presbytery was not to charge Barbara as a witch, but that she be restored to her good name. Around the same time, at the Lady Kirk in South Ronaldsay, another potential witchcraft prosecution was swiftly nipped in the bud. On 28 October 1666, 3 widows and a bereaved mother approached the minister before Sunday sermon. Their menfolk had drowned fishing in Warwick Bay, a sheltered harbourage overlooked by the Kirk. In the wake of this unlikely tragedy, the men's ghosts had started appearing to various people, claiming they'd perished by wicked persons, instruments of Satan. The distraught women wanted the minister, Edward Richardson, to arrange for the graves to be opened so that any wickedness might be brought to light. Parishioners were duly summoned the following day to an inspection of 2 of the bodies. Some persons present at the finding of the victims and who'd helped prepare them for burial were made to handle the disinterred corpses, presumably to test whether they would bleed, emit water, or manifest some other accusatory sign in the presence of suspected murderers. They did not. Richardson duly declared the matter closed and exhorted the parishioners to lay aside all sinistrous or evil thoughts towards any persons. A couple of decades earlier, Orkney ministers, or some of them, avidly fanned the flames of suspicion. Richardson was eager to see them doused. Shifting ministerial attitudes are evident in the seminal description of the Isles of Orkney, written in the 1680s by the Kirkwall minister James Wallace. Wallace had nothing to say about witches, and he thought reliance on healing charms to be now much curbed by the careful industry of our pious ministers. He conceded that pilgrimage, to sites like the Rock of Demise, was still not omitted by the common people, though he refrained from condemning the practice in vehement terms, considering Orkney's network of ruined chapels to be proof that this country was no less anciently than it is at present addicted to devotion. Orkney people, Wallace thought, are generally civil, sagacious, circumspect, and piously inclined. His text, nonetheless, marks the extent of his cultural distance from them. At times, Wallace sounds like a sceptical voice of the early Enlightenment. The inhabitants of Westray believed that if anyone crossed to a certain rock with iron about their person, the surrounding sea would instantly swell, subsiding only when the iron was flung into the water. I, being there to make an experiment of it, offered a shilling to a poor fellow to go upon the rock with a piece of iron, but he wouldn't do it on any terms. The stories, meanwhile, that people in Wyre told about the ruined castle of the supposed giant, Cubby Roo, were idle fables, not fit to be inserted here. Yet even while dismissing the idle fables of the peasantry, Wallace related his own remarkable stories of divine providence, of a fishing boat overturned near Auskerry, and a sole survivor miraculously preserved before being carried to safety by the tides, of a wicked uncle who procured his nephew's execution for a crime he didn't commit, only for his throat to be ripped out by the bishop's dog as he passed the lad's grave in Kirkwall churchyard. Stories of this kind had potential to capture both lay and clerical imaginations. In her seminal study of the phenomenon in England, Alexandra Walsham described providentialism as a point of contact and a cultural cement between the learned outlook of Protestant elites and the traditional mentalities of the people. Yet we should note the qualification suggested by Ian Green, that providentialism was not so much cement as a shared frontier, which looked and functioned very differently according to where one was standing. John Brand, a Church of Scotland commissioner who visited Orkney in 1700 and published an account of his experiences, likewise peppered his text with providential tales. He related with approval a story he heard concerning a boat capsized off the coast of Ely, coming safely to shore on the west side of Sandy after the sailors spent their hours adrift comforting and refreshing one another with places of scripture and notes of sermons which lately they had heard. But divine providence lay in the eye of the beholder. With respect to shipwrecks and salvaged cargo, Brand noted disapprovingly that the more ignorant people instruct this as a favourable providence to them. Therefore, they call these wrecks God's send. Brand was less optimistic than Wallace about the ebbing of popular superstition. He rehearsed a woeful litany of charms, rituals, and superstitious pilgrimages still in regular use among Orcadians. Though their ministers, both privately and publicly, have spoken to them, yet they cannot get them to forbear and abandon these customs. Among old chapels, he devoted particular attention to that of St. Treadwell in Papawestry, situated on a small peninsula jutting into a loch, which was itself believed to have medicinal qualities. If people were cured here, Brand mused, it was by aid and assistance of Satan, whom God in his holy and wise providence may permit so to do, for the further judicial blinding and hardening of those who follow such unwarrantable and unlawful courses. The practices Brand mentions in connection with the site, circumambulations of the loch and depositing of stones at the chapel, were staples of Orcadian magical healing. Brand railed against popish rites, but this was not really popery in the sense of a principled preference for the prescribed preachings of the medieval church or its counter-Reformation successor. Nor does it seem to have been accompanied by any more than the usual quantity of defiance towards the clergy. Anti-clerical outbursts are rare in presbytery and kirk session records. And even Brand conceded that the people are generally tractable, submissive, and respectful to their ministers. It represented rather a prudent and wary regard for long-hallowed places, words, and objects. The instinct was an inclusive one, able to find room for new vectors of magical power, sometimes in disconcerting ways. In the aftermath of the revolution of the 1690s, for example, the Episcopalian minister of South Ronaldsay, Alexander Peterkin, was accused of failing to visit the sick. But this, he said, was because many of the vulgar desire the prayers of the church upon a superstitious rather than a religious account, thinking that if they have any lingering disease, they will thereafter either end or mend. In other words, they didn't grasp the fundamental distinction, one clear at least in Pitcairn's mind, between a prayer and a spell. 30 years earlier, the same parish witnessed an eye-opening instance of the flexibility of the magical mindset. In 1664, the South Ronaldsay session was obliged to acquire a new sackcloth, the rough fabric garment worn by miscreants during the performance of public penance, after the existing one was stolen from the kirk by Jonet Budge, making use of it to her own body and her distracted daughter. With superlative irony, a disciplinary item employed by the Protestant authorities to punish purveyors of superstition had become transformed into an instrument of magical healing, an object infused in Jonet's mind with the sacral power of the kirk. The most remarkable instance of appropriation of Protestant accoutrements for magical purposes is one which may or may not have taken place. I've mentioned already the Stronsay witch Scota Bess. According to a tradition recorded by Walter Trail Denison, she fell victim to a shocking act of vigilante violence. Bess was lured by a group of men to a barn and beaten to death with their flails. Her murderers took the precaution of first dipping the flails in water with which the kirk's communion cup had been washed. There's no contemporary verification of this episode, but local memory of it bears witness to a deep-rooted belief in how powerful spiritual properties might pass into and through the medium of water. This must also explain popular concerns about baptism, mentioned in the statistical account and in John Firth's memoir of rural township life in the 19th century. When several infants were baptized together, it was seen as crucial for male babies to be christened before female ones, otherwise they could never grow beards in later life. Life cycle rituals were an important point of contact between clergy and laity, but it's hard to see how beliefs like this can be meaningfully squared with Reformed sacramental theology. Nor was there any Christian rationale for the widely attested belief that marriages must only be performed during the waxing of the moon. and anxiety certainly prevalent before the Reformation about infants dying unbaptized may scarcely have dissipated after it. According to John Firth, it was considered a dire calamity. Writing about 16th century Suffolk, Dermot McCulloch has remarked that the parson might be regarded, as is often still the case, as a temporary intruder into the unchanging structure of village life. If we substitute minister for parson, island for village, can we say the same of early modern Orkney? To an extent, we probably can. There were deep structural components to a magical worldview that proved remarkably resilient in the face of attempts to reform or replace it. In the 1770s, the Mersey minister George Lowe complained of how people credited many tales of which it's scarcely possible to convince them of the absurdity. There was widespread belief in fairies, prophetic dreams, ghosts and curses, along with superstitions continued from the times of popery, including an attachment for particular churches, chapels and days. The reluctance of people to work on ancient saints' days of their kirks was mentioned by several contributors to the statistical account, and by the Minister of Chaplaincy, George Barry, in his 1805 History of Orkney. Barry bemoaned a multitude of charms that are still in practice, as well as the common people's credulous spirit that leads them to put faith in all the absurd and ridiculous tales concerning witches, fairies, etc. Nothing, of course, ever stays quite the same. Historians often talk about continuity, but usually that means some form of mediated change. Certainly the clerical discourse around superstition evolved. In the early 17th century, it evoked ideas of popish or demonic falsehood. By the later 18th century, it was coming to mean simply ignorance and error. There was, moreover, a sense things were slowly getting better, and that the worst superstitions, like the ability to speak Norn, were becoming a preserve of the elderly. Lowe believed that though pilgrimages to the Broch of Dearest and St. Redwell's Chapel still took place, these superstitions are now much wearing out and are practiced by only a few of the oldest and most ignorant. Similarly, though the belief of witchcraft is almost universal among the lower rank of people, this seems to be in the decline among the younger generation. James Watson, the minister who contributed the section on South Romsey and Bury to the statistical account, admitted the existence of fairies and witches is seriously believed by some, but he was confident that in his parishes were many decent, honest and sensible people who laugh at such absurdities. Even in Orkney, the decline of magic was underway. But in the half-century since the appearance of Sir Keith Thomas's magisterial book with that phrase in its title, the decline of magic has become a problem to be solved rather than just a historical inevitability. In the Orcadian setting, as in other places, magic provided a basically coherent, if messy and eclectic, explanatory framework for a farming community which was to experience little fundamental social change before the agricultural improvements of the 19th century. The magical worldview was also, as I've tried to suggest, a flexible and responsive one. It absorbed tenets of medieval Catholicism and had no principled objection to the sacralities of biblical Protestantism. Customs, traditions, and what we might as well call folklore were in any case not a static deposit, but an evolving set of social and cultural practices. There's archaeological evidence, for example, of coins being left as votive offerings at the Broch of Dearest and St. Redwell's Chapel, perhaps signs of a more petitionary mentality, supplanting or at least supplementing the magical use of stones. According to Wallace, it was believed that St. Redwell's Loch will appear like blood before any disaster befall the royal family. And this sounds to me like an idea inspired or at least reformulated by the turbulent events of Wallace's own century. Protestant ministers were themselves occasionally co-opted into neighbourhood economies of sacred power. There don't seem to be any direct Orcadian instances of a phenomenon discussed by Margot Todd, of characteristic Scottish preachers acquiring reputations as prophets and miracle workers. Excuse me. Nor is there any direct equivalent of the Norwegian tradition of black book ministers, clergymen with occult powers stemming from their possession of secret books. But there are some scattered signs of ministers becoming figures of numinous rather than merely ecclesiastical authority. A tradition from Hoy, told to the folklorist Ernest Marwick, had John Pitcairn, ministered there between 1714 and 1742, bursting into a coven of witches in Warwick and personally vanquishing the devil. In South Ronaldsay, it came to be believed that Edward Richardson had no less than 3 thumbs on each hand. I'm not sure quite what to make of that, but extra digits are in many cultures associated with magical or divine powers. James Morrison, charismatic and combative minister of Eve and Rendell, also left a curious legacy. According to the early 19th century antiquarian Alexander Peterkin, there is still a tradition in the parishes where he ministered that he was a warlock, and that having gone to sea one day in a boat with some of his parishioners, he disappeared miraculously from among them. In fact, Morrison left for Edinburgh in the summer of 1666 to avoid performing public penance for multiple adulteries with parishioners. 19th century Orkney abounded in anecdotes about forceful and eccentric ministers like Robert Reid of Firth and John Gerard of South Ronaldsay, and it may be there were earlier traditions of which no trace has survived. 2 Victorian ministers, Matthew Armour of Sandy and Charles Clouston of Sandwick, were credited with disposing of copies of the Book of the Black Arts, a legendary volume containing spells of great power, but which forfeited owners' souls to the devil if they died possessing a copy, and which could only be sold for a sum smaller than the one paid for it. In conclusion, then, let me try to draw some threads together. The Reformation in Orkney has usually been seen as a bit of a non-event, given the relative ease of institutional transition in the 1560s and an almost complete absence of formal dissent, whether recusant Catholic or sectarian Protestant, prior to the end of the 18th century. There is, I think, a more interesting story to be told, though it's one that's not easy to slot into binary categories of success and failure, resistance and enforced acculturation. Magical beliefs, mentalities and practices were remarkably long-lasting, in part because they were non-dogmatic and accommodating to new influences and techniques. Early modern Orkney didn't exactly witness a clash of cultures, though there was little overt resistance to ministerial authority, and a parallel story could probably be told about Protestant identity formation and the advance of biblical piety and Sabbatarianism. Even the country people listened carefully to sermons, wrote Walter Stewart in the 1640s. Rather, I suspect, religious reform produced a kind of mental and behavioural bifurcation. Orcadians came dutifully to the kirk and were properly deferential to the minister and his utterances, but many continued to inhabit an alternative and parallel world of supernatural experiences, threats and opportunities. Ministers coming from the outside sometimes sensed there was something they were not privy to, something they were not getting. At the end of the 16th century, Joe Benn characterized the inhabitants of Orkney as sly and very subtle, vathrisant et subtilissimi. 2 centuries later, George Lowe remarked that the people of North Ronaldsay have a great deal of cunning and hidden artifice. They use a great many ambiguous expressions, and there's always something more couched under their language than is expressed. I've suggested that the slow demise and prolonged afterlife of the Norn language may have been a factor in this apparent ability to shield and conceal. Yet it was not always a story of opposite objectives and mutual miscomprehension. The final words can go to a North Isles minister standing in his pulpit, even if in recording them, Walter Trail Denison admitted they might be apocryphal ones. "O Lord, gin it be thy will to cast the ship awa', send that bracken ship to the poor island of Sandy." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. An absolutely outstanding paper. So much to think about, and there's already lots of questions filling up the chat. I'd just remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll put them to Peter. I'll just scroll back up, give you a chance to catch your breath after that. And I think the first question was from Thomas. Good to see you, Thomas. And he asked, regarding Norse heritage and the long duration kind of perspective, how does the perception of magic change from the medieval through to the early modern time in Orkney, and how does that differ from those in other instances like England?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question and a very broad question. And I'm afraid probably part of the answer to that is simply we don't know. There is, as people who've studied the history of Orkney know, there's a kind of hole in the middle, which is really the high medieval and late medieval centuries, the post-saga period. So there's a certain amount, as people will probably know, in the Orkney saga and other sagas of magic of various kinds, the Raven Banner of Earl Sigurd and all that sort of stuff, and magic, malign magic being exercised by both men and women. So there is witchcraft of a sort there, but for the main medieval period, we simply don't know. So whether witchcraft is punished at all by the church authorities in 14th, 15th, early 16th century Orkney, we simply have no idea. The very first references to punishment for witchcraft is actually a kind of a bleak one. They're references in the rentals of wicked Earl Patrick Stewart of lands that have been escheated from people who have been burnt for witchcraft, and that's in the 1590s. In the broader scheme of things, to try and answer the question properly, I think I would say there are some things in Orkney folk belief, Orkney witchcraft practices, which look pretty similar to what you would find right across Europe. It's malevolent interpersonal magic, and that's kind of what popular views of witchcraft are sort of everywhere. But there are also things which are quite distinctive. I mean, this idea, which I think I'm right in saying you really only find in Orkney and Shetland witchcraft cases of people becoming concerned because the profit of their corn or the profit of their cow has been stolen. That seems quite distinctively Northern Isles.
It's very interesting. Yeah, local flavour there. There's a few kind of comments and questions arising from the sea taboo words. So Brian posted in the chat there that the Beanie House was the sea taboo word for a church in Burness parish in Sandy. And his father said that stigio was an old word for whiskey. Could that possibly be a sea taboo word as well?
Fantastic. I don't know. The one thing during lockdown which I found impossible to get hold of a copy of is Marwick's Orkney Norn, 1928. I missed the fabulous sale of the unbound copies that were found in the old Leonard stations, I'm afraid. So but I guess that would be the first place to go and look.
Well, there you go. If anyone out there has a copy and would photocopying bits, that would be much appreciated. We've got another comment from Brian Smith, saying that the Shetland witch trials and executions of 1644 can be linked to the departure of the relatively mild administration of the Smith brothers from Orkney, replaced by a new native Shetland administration, as happened after the departure of Patrick Stewart in 1615. New brooms wanted to show that they were severe on witchcraft, so perhaps there's parallels there.
That's very interesting, and yes, Shetland has been rather sort of shamefully omitted from this picture, and I'm very nervous to say anything at all about Shetland in the presence of Brian Smith for obvious reasons. I guess. Yeah, it is that there are these local factors that clearly trigger the hunts, and that makes sense in the case of Shetland. I think that that's probably less obvious for the 1640s in Orkney. Henry Aitken, Sheriff Depute, dies in the middle of the 1643-44 witchcraft push, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily a stimulus there. There are clearly factional issues, as I hinted at. There's a sort of deep divides within the both ecclesiastical and lay elite in Orkney over national issues, really, and the Covenant. And I think that is a factor, particularly in this case I got a bit sort of hooked on of James Bakey's mother, that just runs through the presbytery records over several years.
Excellent. We've got a few comments from Lynn Campbell. Just picking up on some of the points that you mentioned in your talk there, Peter. She said that she knows somebody who had eye troubles and had the opportunity to walk around St Treadwell's loch, and she was cured, and that's a completely true story, and you should believe that. And she also says that the baptism, she's seen that elsewhere, that if girls were baptized first, they were the ones who would grow facial hair, and then the boys would have sparse growth. And that apparently, and this is a hot take, that the book of the black arts is buried in the garden of the former Sandwich manse today.
Right.
So
Yes.
if anyone's in the area and wants to dig that up, it might have
Leave it
something to
alone.
do with
Don't dig it
marking
up.
and
That'd be a very,
or
very
just
bad idea.
okay, don't do that. Not even for to help with marking. Lots of comments saying thank you very much. Lynn's also commented about Stigo, that she's looked it up in the Orkney Norn and all dictionaries, and it doesn't appear in any format that she can find anyway.
Okay.
There's a question here from Linda, and actually it links into something that Jonathan Westaway's asked as well. Linda says that I am Sami, Norse, and Orcadian. Am I crazy if I see a thread connecting their magic forms? Vikings considered the Sami as the best wizards. Could there not be a lineage there? And related to that, Jonathan's also made a comment. If my mouse will work, there we go. Is there any evidence of Orkney ministers drawing on Scandinavian Reformation traditions and campaigns against Sami witchcraft?
Yeah, really interesting questions, and a bit outside my sort of field of expertise. So I am just back from a brief trip to Troms and Denmark, so that part of the world is very much in my mind. I mean, insofar as I understand it, which may not be very far, the Sami tradition is a shamanistic one, and that means that the magic practitioners are mainly men. And so this has been connected by some historians, Ronald Hutton, for example, to the fact that Icelandic witchcraft cases are largely male. Russian ones are as well. Orkney much more fits the Scottish and indeed West European pattern. That, you know, I think, trying to remember the exact figure, I worked it out once, that it's about 80% of the witchcraft accusations in Orkney are made against women rather than men, and that looks very sort of, you know, standard.
Yeah.
In terms of links between the Scandinavian and Orkney Reformations, I'm not sure about this. Gordon Donaldson suggested many years ago that there was a kind of link in the mildness and non-iconoclastic nature of the Orkney Reformation, and the fact that St Mangus Cathedral isn't trashed by angry mobs, basically, and that looks much more like a kind of Lutheran Scandinavian Reformation. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the timescales are very different. So the sort of spiritual links with Norway are really being broken at the time that the Danes are imposing a Lutheran Reformation there in the mid-1530s. And of course, you know, Scottish Presbyterianism has no time really for the Lutheran tradition. It's a question, I think, which is worth keeping open, and what sort of traffic there is back and forth, you know, across the North Sea, and you know, Orkney merchants in Bergen are presumably going to Lutheran churches, and, you know, seeing the practices there, and vice versa. So, you know, if anyone has information or thoughts about that, I'd really be pleased to hear them.
Excellent. I think Catherine Zuckerberg, sorry, is in the audience, so perhaps Catherine might know. She might post below. Let's have a look. We've got another comment from Fran saying that she also has a strong claim to be cured by St Treadwell, so it's still alive and well. Thomas says thank you very much, and he says that he can appreciate such source gaps being a Swedish medievalist, so a kindred spirit. We have a question from Annie. She says, thank you very much, Peter. Do you have any opinion on whether suspected witches were held in the dungeon in St Magus Cathedral? I've heard it presented as a hypothesis, but no evidence that I know
of. Yeah. So I think that the assumption is that they were or must have been, but I don't think there is documentary evidence stating that explicitly. In the case of Barbara Boundy, which gets linked up with the Marjorie Papley, James Bakey stuff, where it's very, very murky, where apparently there is a faction which is trying to get her to commit suicide in prison, and a knife has been sort of lifted up to the bars. Whether that actually enables us to, have that as the bottleneck opening of Marwick's hole, I don't know. But it doesn't appear in the Presbytery records, or I think any comment that people are to be taken and put in that particular place.
Okay.
But certainly the Presbytery trials were held in the cathedral, so it makes absolute sense that suspects would be there, brought out, and then put back in. The trial was concluded.
Well, you've got to make use of a dungeon if you've got one, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Lots of comments coming in, just saying thank you very much for the paper. A follow-up question from Brian, just saying, just following up on your point about Harry Aitken. He was father-in-law of Andrew Smith, the mild sheriff of Shetland, who gave up that office in 1643. I wonder if the new administrators who appeared in Shetland and Orkney in the 1640s were anxious to make their presence felt.
It's a very interesting thought, and I'd be, if Brian has further thoughts on that, if he's willing to get in touch, I'd be very happy to pursue that a bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. That's maybe a great idea. Actually, I might abuse my position as chair to ask a kind of a related question, something that I was thinking about. Unsurprisingly, as soon as you said 1640s and Covenanters, that's when my ears picked up. But just going on kind of the case that you presented today, and something that you talked about in your chapter in the early modern Scottish clergy collection, about the kind of elastic approach, shall we say it, that the Orcadian ministry take to some aspects of enacting the church's will, sometimes due to kind of practical elements, almost like a laissez-faire attitude, but then contrasting that quite sharply with what happens in the 1640s, especially that kind of the witch hunts that you talked about today. Why is that? Is this an example of these kind of clergymen from outside trying to impose what is by that point quite a hardline church administration, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah. So I think it probably, and this kind of echoes Brian's earlier point maybe in a way, is concerned with the moment where Orkney kind of puts itself on the national stage, which is to spearhead the attack on episcopacy with the very public humbling of Bishop Graham and his voluntary renunciation of his episcopal office after Walter Stewart and I think another minister, rush to the General Assembly with this long list of charges against him. I mean, that's a sort of revolutionary moment, but there's in some ways rather less to it than it appears. Graham abjectly renounces his episcopacy, but keeps his estates and lands in Orkney, and his son-in-law, Patrick Braho, and his own son, who's a minister, and a nephew, who's another minister, remain. So that there is sort of, even in the Presbyterian revolutionary moment of the 1640s, there's still kind of a post-episcopal regime in place in Orkney, I think. And in fact, the sort of, the zealous kind of advocates of the covenant are this small minority, particularly this extraordinarily troublesome character, Patrick Waterston, about, who a whole book could be written, I think. He's constantly in trouble. And that leads to the bizarre situation that the Episcopalians, or the people sort of leaning in slightly Episcopalian direction, who you might expect to be a little bit more skeptical about the whole witchcraft thing, are the ones who are pursuing this case against Marjorie Papley and all the other witches in that network, because that is a way of bringing down Bakey and his Covenanting allies.
I see. Local politics. Okay, right. Okay, very interesting. Lots of questions coming in. I'll try and get through as many of these as we can. Linda just following up, just saying that she knows that there were Sami female shamans, and they were in places like Siberia. and that they were written out of the shamanistic narrative by male historians, etc.
Typical, yeah.
Which wouldn't be the first time that's happened. We've got a question, Eva Jordan. What was the fate of urbanized babies? I am a descendant of Yorkshire witches. The Kingswood still holds my father's name. He's blonde, blue-eyed, and my mother's line fought in the 1798 Irish Revolution. I'm not quite sure what the urbanized babies refers to.
I'm wondering if that's a typo for unbaptized babies, maybe.
Ah, right.
Yes. Which is again a kind of interesting but unanswerable question. Theologically, there isn't really a problem in the Calvinist 17th century Church of Scotland, because baptism is just a sort of covenantal symbol. It's not a sacramental. Well, it is a sacrament, but it's not a rite that actually confers saving grace in the medieval understanding. So technically, before the Reformation, an unbaptized baby cannot possibly be admitted to heaven, which is why the medieval church comes up with this notion of a kind of limbo, which is not hell, where unbaptized babies will not suffer, but because they're not Christians, can't actually be admitted to heaven. This may be another area, I think, where actually Orkney is not that untypical, that in fact, no matter what Protestant theology said, people wanted their babies baptized as quickly as possible. And, concerns about the status of unbaptized infants are very, very long lasting and very widespread.
And Ava's just clarified, sorry, it was baptized. No, very interesting. We've got a question from Leslie Ann in reference to the woman beaten with flails. Is there any other evidence of vigilantes? She's asking because of rumoured involvement of Orcadian sailors in Pittenweem murder in Pittenweem of a supposed witch.
Yeah, interesting. I was about to say no, but in fact there is a documented case from Stromness in 1670, which is a complaint from the bishop of a woman who is attacked by another woman and struck with a stone, and it's sort of presented as an attempted murder. But the victim is a charmer who is suspected of the usual thing of actually having cursed the assailant's husband, and it looks very likely that what's going on is an attempt to bleed the witch. So you draw blood above the breath. And that's a recognized meaning of breaking a spell. So it's kind of not surprising, really, that the vigilante cases might come a little bit later, because once the authorities have ceased to prosecute witches very much, and again, this is something which is probably European-wide in scope, that the sort of trajectories of belief are on different timescales here. So elite concern about witches is very concentrated in this witch hunting century of 1560, 1660. But actual, popular belief in malign magic, when does that come to an end? It's probably thriving into the 19th century, and, maybe even now is not entirely gone. I don't want to suggest I sort of, feel sympathy for these people who are attacking suspected witches, but, there's a sense in which they've been abandoned by the authorities. And, perhaps the vigilante action of that kind is all that's left. I haven't really seen many more cases of it. Although I think actually one of the writers to the statistical account in the 1690s mentions that in his parish it's quite common for people to attack suspected witches and try and draw blood from them.
All right. Okay, that's very interesting. You would think as well, because of the authority given to the sheriff court, as opposed to waiting for essentially mandated committee being sent, that perhaps they had better access to the kind of legal framework in order to do this, so maybe there wasn't the need for vigilante action.
I hadn't really sort of thought of it in those terms, Andrew, but that's very interesting and possibly right. It seems in some ways quite a well-oiled machine.
Yeah.
But suspicions come to the Kirk session in the first instance, then on to the presbytery, and having been kind of screened, then passed to the sheriff court.
Excellent. Right, I think that might be the end of the questions. Let me just, scroll down. A quick question from Ava, kind of linking into the kind of the marks of a witch. How about moles, and acne, or places on the witch's body feeding demons? Any references to these?
Haven't found any in the Orkney cases, which is interesting, and I haven't actually really found any references to witches' familiars in the way that you get in witchcraft cases elsewhere. I mean, what you do have is just lots and lots of livestock. Yeah, I mean, I did a count on this at one point, and of the 39 cases we know about in detail, there are 30 which involve cattle, and there are almost as many which involve horses.
Yeah.
This is one of the, if you like, the characteristic activities of Orkney witches, or actually, probably putting it a better way, one of the sort of the deep concerns of Orcadian people is that their animals are vulnerable. And of course, as people will know, their animals are literally living with them in the same building at the other end of the longhouse. So sheep don't appear in witchcraft cases at all, because they're not there in the domestic setting. They're not quite as valuable either as either cattle or horses. I don't know. Maybe that helps to explain the absence of other kinds of domesticated animals in the cases.
That's very interesting. I know that Julian Gooders talked about that before, the kind of link between the kind of cattle economy and slander and cursing. So yeah, maybe there's something there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we are pushing on, but if anyone has any final questions that they're dying to ask, please do jump in the chat before we give Peter a much deserved break. Just lots of thank yous coming in, Peter, for the paper, including from places like Denmark and the States. So it's lovely to see everyone.
Fantastic.
Okay, I think that's maybe us. I think we're maybe at the end of the questions. So all that's left for me to do is just to bring things to a close. And first and foremost, I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, massive thank you to you, Peter, for a really excellent paper, stimulating stuff, and I'm sure people will follow up on emails and things like that about this. And again, lots of thank yous coming in the chat. So
thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for really interesting and stimulating questions, which I'll be thinking about for a long time after this, I'm sure.
Excellent. I would do my traditional kind of awkward round of applause. It doesn't really work in this format, but thank you very much for giving up your time this evening to come and speak to us.
Great.
And all that's left for me to do before I can let everyone go on with their evenings is to warmly invite everyone back again next month, where we will be receiving a paper from Brian, who's in the audience tonight, Brian Smith from Shetland Museums and Archives, who will be presenting a paper on Shetland and the sagas, invisible or hidden, which I've got no doubt at all will be of interest to many people here tonight. But until then, thank you to everyone for tuning in this evening. Have a lovely evening, and I hope to see you all back here next month.